Hello, in this presentation I will be talking about the Kariba Dam. We will start by exploring the historical context in which its idea was developed, then we will look at its planning and construction stage. We will go on to looking at the impacts relocation had on the Zimbabwean Tonga people, which I will be referring as the Tonga people. We will then look at the animal rescue operation, Operation Noah, before finishing up with the bibliography. The background of the construction of the Kariba Dam, which started in 1955, was marked by several development movements, central to understanding why it came about. Namely, and perhaps the most important one, was Truman's four-point speech in 1949, which triggered a development fever, which Tischler characterized as post-war development colonialism. This also included large-scale projects such as the Groundnut Scheme and, obviously, the Kariba Dam. It was characterized by state intervention in the name of development, and it was thought that the government would be able to control social, economic, and political factors when there was a project that united the nation. Also, the dam was built while colonial society adhered to James Scott's high modernism ideology, which argued that believing in the authority and power of science and development would improve the human condition. This encompassed social engineering projects such as dams, reorganizations of cities and forests, and resettlement schemes. This rhetoric used a lexicon which included words such as catching up and history started with development projects. This ideology is central to understanding the colonial white settlers' mindset. The idea of a dam was put forward to the young Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, today known as Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, which had been created in 1953 to politically unite the territories controlled by the British. The federation was widely opposed by black Africans, as it only gave power to white settlers. Tischler argues Kariba was intrinsically linked to nation building, as the federation was constantly in conflict due to its dual society caused by apartheid and the white settlers' desire to emancipate themselves from the British Empire. Indeed, as David McDermott Hughes demonstrates, colonizers were a minority that refused to integrate with black Africans. Instead, they put their mark on the place by reimagining landscapes while excluding Africans from these places. Thus, the hydroelectric project was meant to help solve tensions between the northern and southern white society. However, the first difficulty in this project was choosing between a big and more expensive dam on the Zambezi River or a smaller and cheaper one on the Kafue River. Ultimately, the Zambezi River was chosen as the perfect building site. Other than being a symbol to the Federation, the dam was also built to provide cheap electricity to the developing copper industry of northern Rhodesia and the advancing industrial centers of South Rhodesia. The Kariba Dam construction was announced in 1955. It was going to be the largest dam on the planet, and its cost was estimated to be around £78 million. It was going to be a symbol of the Federation's partnership, which was fragile under fierce African opposition. It was supervised and built by an Italian construction company called Impresit, and it was designed by French engineer André Cornier, a specialist in arched dams. It ended up creating the biggest man-made lake at the time. An interesting detail is that relocation had no impact on the planning stage at all. A discourse of taming the wild river was used to exclude the 23,000 Zimbabwean Tonga people from their homeland by claiming even they were unable to use the dangerous water from the river. Thus, the apparition of the dam was theoretically going to benefit them greatly too. Colonial white Rhodesians further maintained that the relocation of the Tonga people would civilize them, as they would be taken to a modern world where they would have access to school, churches, stores, and hospitals. Yet, by 1955, no plans had been formulated to relocate the Tonga people, which later led to a hasty and traumatic resettlement experience. For its construction, 1 million cubic meters of concrete were used to erect the 36-meter-high wall. The construction was set back several times, namely when the Zambezi flooded twice in 2 years, once in 1957, destroying some access roads, and the following year in 1958, wrecking the access bridge and parts of the main wall. This was very unexpected and defied all odds, and it set back the construction of the dam for a few months. This also meant the budget surpassed the £78 million set apart for this construction to attain £135 million. It used up around 40% of the Federation's gross national product. A lot of new technology was used to clear the lake from trees, such as steel spheres. As the water rose, the authorities started evacuating the valley of its inhabitants. The resettlement of the Tonga people was not a pleasant experience. It was marked with injustice and unfairness for the Tonga people. They were moved far away from the lake in a harsh environment, with little to no government help. To make place for the hydroelectric installation, the Zimbabwean Tonga people, or the river people, were resettled far away from the fertile river banks to the deserted uplands area of Binga, which were bushy, waterless, and in some places sandy. Due to irregular rains, the uplands were not good for growing vegetables. Another issue the Tonga people faced in the uplands was animals. Firstly, the area was infested with the tsetse fly, which increased the risk of diseases. Then, they were also settled within a national park, which imposed a huge amount of restrictions on the Tonga people since they were near animal sanctuaries. For example, they were not allowed to hunt, collect firewood, or harvest plants, herbs, and mushrooms. Finally, the wildlife abundant area meant the Tonga found it hard to defend themselves and their field against animals. When they complained, they would be intimidated by the rangers. The fact that they were in the uplands also caused a myriad of other problems, namely, they no longer had access to their main resource, water. Women had to wake up at dawn to go fetch the water from the lake and bring it back to the settlements. This also meant that they were unable to keep livestock due to the lack of water, effectively depleting their only source of protein. However, the water was being pumped from the lake to Bulawayo, which was 430 kilometers away from the lake, but officials did not want to supply it to the Tonga, who lived much closer. Interestingly, the Tonga people were not given access to electricity the Kariba plant was generating, despite it having been promised to them when they were being convinced to move from their ancestral homes. The lake was curated to secure white settlers' interests and greatly limit the Tonga's rights. For instance, fishing. White settlers had commercial fishing rights, while the Tongas were confined to gill net fishing. Often, they lacked adequate fishing equipment, so instead they would become contract workers for commercial fishermen who would exploit them. They would be paid in meager food rations or in temporary authorizations to fish privately in areas where they typically weren't allowed to bait the hook. The companies benefited from this, as the Tonga people were merely contract workers and thus did not have health insurance or paid sick leave. The fact that the Tonga people had very limited access to fish and no livestock meant that they no longer had protein in their diet. This caused malnutrition and diarrhea. Additionally, due to the dryness of the uplands, many Tonga people created illegal gardens on the shores of the Kariba Lake to secure their livelihood. However, they were prone to flooding depending on how the dam waters were controlled. Another issue which came out of the lake being controlled by colonialists was cultural appropriation. As we have discussed, the Tonga was painted as primitive and as a tribe which worshipped the river god, called the Nyami Nyami. This term was appropriated by the tourist industry. Hotels, boat rentals, and safaris exploited the Tonga's god for money, as he appealed to tourists who were seeking exotic experiences. A facet of the displacement which is often overlooked is the fact that the Tonga also lost an immense part of their culture. Ancestral graves, sacred caves, pools, and shrines were all flooded by the waters of the Zambezi. This exploitation of the little culture they had left was traumatic to them. Reflecting the values of James Scott's high modernism, colonial white Rhodesians justified the Tonga resettlement by claiming that history was just starting for these tribes, and that they would get out of their primitive states and finally join civilization. This discourse was very harmful to Tonga people, as they were seen and treated as mentally stunted, thus effectively robbing them of their voices and opinions. The colonialists had not considered the relocation of the Tonga. However, they did plan for rescuing the local fauna of the Gwembe Valley through Operation Noah. Indeed, as the water rose and big animals found themselves stuck on islands, boats were taken out and animals were captured, one by one, and put into cages to then be released on dry land. The operation was dangerous as the submerged trees threatened to breach the hulls of the boats, and the islands were populated by many snakes. Around 7,000 animals were saved during this operation, including 44 rhinos. However, many animals were left stranded, unable to swim, either starving to death or drowning. Many smaller ecosystems were destroyed by the rising waters. As we can see, it can be argued the colonial government cared more for animals than humans. These are the sources I used to support my presentation. My main crutches were Tischler's and Machine Guides' works, who delved into the intricacies of the planning and context of the Kariba Dam, as well as resettlement. A lot of these sources ignored the issue of displacement, which was quite interesting. For example, the book written by Jonathan Feary, Smacktin and Sardu Shera, idealizes the presence of the dam, only mentioning in passing that poverty is persistent around the basin, but does not detail the statement. The Kariba Dam scholarship is thus greatly divided. There is a very great deal about displacement and a huge amount on the ecology of the basin. Very few books striking in between. To conclude, the Kariba Dam was a project that was born out of the desire to further consolidate the young federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. It was a very heavy investment for the federation. However, it was considered central to the federation's prospects. An impact the construction of the dam had was displacing the 23,000 Zimbabwe Tonga people who lived in the valley, forcing them to leave behind their culture and forcing them to face a world where the white settlers made them feel unwelcomed.